Hi everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're going to be looking at a hotly anticipated feature in the future of Escape from Tarkov, which is that of armoured rigs. But will it change the game in the way that you think? Stick around and let's find out. Tarkov is supposed to be a realistic game. Well, ish. This means that it attempts to simulate the complexities of real life within a video game, or as the developers have put it in the past, as realistically as playable. Fundamentally, a game is a model, and a game that aims for realism then effectively attempts to simulate real life, simplified to work within a PC to a greater or lesser extent depending on the level of realism that is intended or required. The changes to armor hitboxes are one of the upcoming features that people are most interested in, and more specifically the ability to use modular, replaceable armor plates in customizable rigs. But the real question is, outside of the initial obvious answers, what will this do to the way that ballistics and gunfights play out in EFT? To answer this question, we need to start by taking a quick look at how the model works now. Let's run through a brief overview of the key points that matter for this discussion. I also have an old but fairly comprehensive video covering the in-depth specifics if you're new to Tarkov or just need a refresher, which I'll link above. In summary, each armor has a protection level of 1 to 6, a durability and a material. Each piece of armor lists the body parts that it covers on the armor itself in the stat screen. Armor also doesn't affect hitboxes, as the hitboxes are the same no matter what the armor looks like. A large piece of armor that covers the thorax has the same hitbox as a slim piece of armor that also covers the thorax and doesn't make you any bigger of a target. The actual protection a piece of armor gives to the player is also implemented with relative simplicity at the moment, covering fully the hitbox that is listed. It makes no difference whether the model itself looks like it's large, small, whatever. If it says it covers the stomach or the thorax, it covers the entire hitbox. Taking a look at the high-level armor, the slick, for example, these are very small, and if you look at them on your model, it makes sense that they only cover the thorax hitbox, but to cover everything around the outside edge from the front and the back and the sides is a bit of an oversimplification. This is ultimately what makes high-tier armor potentially very powerful, and incentivizes players to use the highest pen ammo that they can, as you give yourself a much greater chance of killing your opponent if you can shoot both the thorax and the head for the kill, rather than just the head. While there are some uses of the leg meta strategy, such as the KS-23 shotgun, which is very effective at avoiding this armor discussion altogether, the majority of the player base trends towards high pen ammo simply because it's easier and more effective to get kills this way in general. Just look at M61 ammo at the end of last wipe. Given it clears out all helmets in one shot and any armor in 2 shots to the thorax as if it wasn't there, it's obvious to see why people who have the money run this type of round over any other. So the commonly thought of solution to this problem is modular armor plates and enhanced armor hitboxes. What this effectively means is that you'll be able to shoot through those gaps that we looked at before, and the armor will only be effective at stopping rounds if, well, hit the armor. The idea is that these areas with no coverage overall on the armor will slow down the high pen only meta, as lower pen rounds will also be able to score hits on actual player bodies rather than just being absorbed into Chad players like a big sponge. Okay, so before we move on to the practical ramifications of changing to this system, we need to talk about penetration mechanics themselves first, as this is the other important element in this discussion. I've done some fairly detailed work on penetration chance in other videos and how it works in the existing system, which you can check out here, and we'll be building on these principles in a moment. But in short, the penetration of a round and the armor class of the armor that it's coming up against, along with the durability of the armor itself, dictates the penetration chance of a bullet. This is how the system currently works. The penetration chance begins at 0 for low pen rounds, hits a certain specific threshold of round pen, at which point the chance to penetrate climbs quickly and reaches the high 90s in a range of about 10 pen. With the plate system instead, this changes the equation overall, because what we're going to do is look at a model that takes into account the entire hitbox and not just the armor itself, that I think is functionally equivalent to the changes that will be made when this system is implemented. However, this is where my main assumption comes into play, that we cannot specifically target within a hitbox to avoid armor and score easy hits on unprotected areas. I find it very hard to believe that anyone other than maybe the top 0.1% of players will realistically be able to precisely target the unprotected areas of armor on a player's body. Maybe I'm wrong here, but in my experience most fights in Tarkov at close range are aim punch and screen blur, hold mouse 1 and pray cluster messes, and at long range if someone is moving, it's even harder to snag a specific shot. So let's just move on as if this is true for now. The modular system and enhanced hitboxes represent some areas of protection and some areas with none. What this will effectively do in practice is to raise the base pen from 0 for low pen rounds to some number, which is the chance of a round avoiding hitting an armoured plate and hitting a PMC's body instead. In our current system, a 9x19 PSO round has a 0% chance to penetrate a class 6 slick. But once we introduce the possibility of avoiding the armor altogether, and assuming as we said that you can't target specific areas of the hitbox, the pen chance becomes the ratio of the unarmored hitbox when compared to the size of the hitbox overall. Just for argument's sake for a moment, if the slick covers 50% of the thorax area, the effective pen chance of 9x19 PSO becomes 50%, i.e. it's 0 if it hits the slick, but 100% if it manages to avoid it. Most interestingly, this will affect different armors in different ways. For example, a Gen 4 full or assault that has practically 100% hitbox coverage will be unaffected and act like it does now. However, as we saw in the previous example, slicks and some of the other armors with a small coverage area will now have a very different penetration profile. This is easy to see if we take it to its logical extreme, where you can have the best armor in the world, but if it only covers 1 square inch of your hitbox, it will practically give no benefit at all. This differentiation is clearly important, but how much would it change the pen tables that we've looked at previously? To help here, we're going to define an armor's coverage ratio as the area of the hitbox covered by the armor as a fraction of the total area of that hitbox. To note, this ratio could be different depending on exactly where the shooter is standing relative to their target, i.e. from the front, the side, or the back. But to use the example that we had previously again, an armor that covers half of the player's hitbox would have a coverage ratio of 0.5. Full coverage is 1, and no coverage would be 0. So for an armor with 0.5 coverage, half of the rounds will hit the armor and the other half will hit the player unarmored. As we said previously, this starts the penetration for any round at 50%, but then for any other round, what effectively happens to the pen is that the gap between the round's penetration in the current model and 100% is halved. If you had a round that would have penetrated 70% of the time before, well now half of your shots don't even hit armor, so they're guaranteed to go through, and the remaining half still go through 70% of the time when they do hit a plate, giving you an overall 85% success rate of dealing damage, which is halfway between 70 and 100%. For those who are interested in a little bit of maths, we can generalize this to the penetration in the new model equals the penetration in the old model times by the coverage ratio, i.e. the number of times you're going to be hitting a piece of armor, plus 100% times 1 minus the coverage ratio, i.e. the 100% guaranteed chance to pen because you're not actually hitting armor at all. This simplifies down to the old pen minus 1 times the coverage ratio plus 1. For example, a round that only pens 35% of the time versus an armor with a 30% coverage ratio, which would be very low by the way, this moves 70% of the way from where it was to 100, getting to 80.5% effective pen. Now that we have everything fully fleshed out, where do the interesting choices start to appear from? Well, let's take a look at some of the armors that we've been discussing so far. The original protection profile for level 5 and level 6 armor looks like this, with level 6 strictly better in all cases, defending against a higher section of rounds than the level 5. However, if we introduce a 70% coverage ratio for something like the slick, you end up with an interesting outcome where against lower pen rounds you're actually better off with the level 5, but against higher pen rounds you're still better off with the level 6 due to the significantly greater protection it provides when a round does land on the armor. This gives a trade-off between the two ends of the penetration spectrum. This is why I personally believe that all the plate system will do in the end is effectively tweak the parameters of the armor penetration as we've described, and nerf high tier armor with low coverage significantly. Whether this is good or bad in the end is up for debate, but it would definitely be interesting to have more varied profiles of penetration across the armor spectrum, although I think a very similar effect could be achieved in a much simpler way. Is the model that we've come up with strictly correct? Well, of course not, as it's an approximation of the real implementation of the armor hitbox, which itself is a model of the real world where you do have the chance to shoot through unarmored parts of enemies. But I think in the vast majority of fights, there is no way most players are going to be able to pinpoint their shots like this. The main reason why I am looking forward to the plates rework is to prevent the thorax-only meta, as the modular damage model would prevent armor on arm hitboxes from removing thorax armor durability when hit, i.e. having separate armor durability for the different hitboxes that they cover, much like the current player health system. This is probably the biggest flaw in the existing model as far as I'm concerned, because it brings the greatest unexpected consequence or unintuitive result to the game, which leads to players specifically not protecting parts of their PMC other than the thorax to prevent losing thorax armor when hit in the other hitboxes. This comes down to two simple facts tied together, that number 1, you die if your thorax hits 0 unlike your arms or your stomach, and number 2, that armor durability is shared across all hitboxes at the moment. With modular durability and some pen chance adjustments, I think this would address most of the issues with the current system without being a radical overhaul of the game's existing model. However, the one huge benefit of the fully fledged system is that it will be amazing to choose the protection you take with you more precisely, and I do hope there are some decent trade-offs between weight and armour along with coverage ratios that gives you interesting choices to make when putting together your loadout. I look forward to trying it out when it arrives eventually. If you learned something or enjoyed today's video and want to support the channel, please as always consider sending a like and a comment, as it helps with visibility for those who haven't found me yet on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter and Twitch to check out when I'm live, which is currently 2 times a week, once on Friday at 9 PM UK time for the real-time recording of the Scav Talk podcast, which you can check out the link to in the description below, and a regular Tarkov stream on Saturday at 2 PM UK time in the afternoon. And with all that said, I'll see you next time, and as always, have fun in your raids.